Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel on climate justice. I'm Karen McGlathery. I'm director of UVA's Environmental Resilience Institute and also a professor of environmental sciences. Our panel today is part of a 2-week Climate Ambition Summit. That's a series of events hosted by the Environmental Resilience Institute in partnership with Lifetime Learning and the Office of Engagement. I'm really pleased to note that of the people registering for today's event, we have folks from 27 states and 7 foreign countries. And also, really importantly, we have the largest number of registrants who are currently students at UVA. And so really pleased that you're here with us today as well. So over the last 2 weeks, the Climate Ambition Summit has brought together UVA community members and global leaders to focus on the critical issue of climate change from many perspectives, from science and technology, equity and justice, and economics and business. And I'm particularly excited about this panel because every climate change issue is also a climate justice issue. Whether we're talking about reducing carbon emissions or making cities and coasts more resilient, we have to recognize that climate change has a disproportionate impact on historically marginalized or underserved populations. And also, as we think about climate solutions, they will not likely benefit all populations equally. So climate equity and climate justice has to be a central tenet of any adaptation or mitigation strategy. So before I introduce our panelists and our moderator, I want to just note that during the session, during the webinar, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and we'll monitor those and answer as many as we can during the panel. So I'd like to introduce our speakers now. Barbara Brown Wilson is an associate professor of urban and environmental planning at the UVA School of Architecture, and she is also the co-founder and faculty director of the UVA Equity Center. Her research and teaching focuses on the history, theory, ethics, and practice of planning for climate justice, and on the role of urban social movements in the built world. She published a book in 2018 on Resilience for All, Striving for Equity Through Community-Driven Design. Kimberly Fields is an assistant professor of African and African American studies at UVA. She is trained as a political scientist, and her work is at the intersection of Black politics, environmental studies, public policy, and the history and development of African American political thought. Kim focuses on official efforts at the state and federal level to address the racial dimensions of environmental inequality through public policy. Howie Epstein is a professor and chair of environmental sciences. His research focuses on climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems, and he's done field work across the Arctic in Alaska, Canada, and Russia. Howie currently leads a large interdisciplinary project that's focused on the interaction of the natural and built environment in the northernmost community in the Alaskan Arctic. And he works closely on that project with the indigenous community. Howie contributed to the 2019 International Panel on Climate Change and has served on the board of directors of the Arctic Research Consortium. So our panelists will be moderated today by Ian Baucom. Ian is the Buckner W. Clay Dean of the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And he recently published a book titled History 4 Degrees Celsius, where he puts Black studies into the conservation about climate change. And so Ian, I'm going to pass the program now on to you. So welcome, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Karen, and Althea, Dana, everyone who has organized today's panel and this full set of events. These are sort of crucial and urgent questions for us to be discussing. Thanks so much to you for joining us and to all the panelists. I'm going to try to spend most of my time staying out of the way so that you can listen to the panelists. What I thought I would do to get us started is just to ask a common question to all 3 of the panelists to get us started, and just very broadly to ask you to talk about your work and how within the work that you've been doing there are questions that arise for you that you think just put some key framing around this crucial issue of thinking the relationship between climate change and justice, just to sort of get us going, but in relationship to the work you've been doing. Barbara, I think I'll start with you.
Thanks so much, Dean Baucom. I'm really happy to be here and in conversation on this incredibly important topic with lovely colleagues from across the university. In my own work, I'm interested, so I teach in urban planning, as Karen mentioned, and I'm really concerned with how our values, our collective social values, get codified into the built world. So I often study social movements like the civil rights movement and the environmental movement and the disability rights movement, and look both historically and today at how we are or are not building those values into our land use decisions, into the built world, into our neighborhoods, and who's making those decisions is a big consequence, right, for what gets decided. And so much of my work in the past few years has really been around breaking open decision-making processes, land use decision-making, but also knowledge production. So I am the current faculty director, but also one of the proud co-founders of, it's a long name, I like to say, because our founding director was a civil rights lawyer, Dean Dana Matthew. But so it's the Democracy Initiative Center for the Redress of Inequity Through Community Engaged Scholarship, because like any good lawyer, it says what we do. But basically, every decision we make is centered on the role that the university as an anchor institution should be playing in the local redress of inequity, and every decision we make has lived expertise as the driving force. So my bosses are a steering committee of local leaders who care about racial and social inequities and their active redress. And I have a whole set of partners that I work with to make sure that every decision we make is about mutual benefit, about respect, about shared power, about youth voice. And that's what guides our scholarship. That's what guides the production of research that we hope, is change oriented. It's towards those ends. And we've been really lucky to work both in Charlottesville and with the Environmental Resilience Institute on the Eastern Shore on climate justice issues that have really been not only about what we call the democratization of data, the mapping of burdens that are borne inequitably. So, the disproportionate impact of a lot of our land use decisions have direct relationships with climate injustice. Try to raise up those patterns so that then both decision makers and activists can have a shared set of data points to then push for a more climate just environment.
Great, thank you, Barbara, so much. Kimberly, let me just turn to you with the same question.
Sure, thanks again for having me here. I'm, like Barbara, excited to talk with my colleagues here about this topic. So in terms of my own work, I look at a subset of environmental policies called environmental justice policies, and I look at them at the state level. So what kinds of environmental justice related efforts have states adopted? And then I explore the variation between those efforts to kind of understand what explains those variations, what impact those variations have on stated goals, particularly reducing or eliminating the disparities in exposure to environmental risks. So I look, that's kind of what my research has been on for a while. In terms of how that relates to climate change and climate justice, what I've been interested in is how have the efforts to address climate change and the racial dimensions of climate change, how have they considered marginalized and vulnerable populations? To what degree do those efforts reflect those populations' demands, their concerns, and additionally, how do those efforts address their needs? Like, is there anything within them that seem to be targeting or particularly protecting these vulnerable populations? And so that's kind of how my work frames part of what our discussion will be around climate justice today.
Great, thank you, Kimberly. And Howie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to my colleagues for joining in this important conversation. So as Karen said, I'm an environmental scientist, and I've been working in Arctic ecosystems for about 25 years now. And we have a new research project that's studying the effects of climate change on a largely indigenous community in northern Alaska. It's Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost community in the United States. And we're examining how climate change interacts with the community infrastructure and then causes changes to the Arctic landscape that then feed back to affect those same buildings that sit on those landscapes. And the Arctic, through no fault of its own, is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. On average, it's warmed about 2 degrees Celsius since 1900. That's compared to 1 degree Celsius, which is the average for the globe. And only 4 million people live in the Arctic, and that is compared to almost 8 billion people living globally. So the greenhouse gas emissions from the Arctic are pretty minor, yet the Arctic communities are feeling the brunt of climate change. The entire Arctic is underlain by permanently frozen ground, and that can be rock or soil or ice. And then when warming climates melt the ground ice, that causes the ground surface to slump, and that has damaging effects on the infrastructure in these rural communities. Another important effect in Arctic ecosystems is that summer sea ice in the Arctic Ocean is disappearing at a pretty alarming rate, probably changing faster than anything else on the planet with respect to climate change. This causes changes in the local weather and leads to coastal erosion. And many indigenous communities in the Arctic are coastal, and they rely on subsistence marine hunting for at least a part of their livelihoods. And so the combination of reduced sea ice, permafrost thaw, is causing serious coastal erosion that's threatening these communities. And some communities have been faced with the prospect of moving their entire communities. In fact, there were a few pieces in the news today about communities in northwestern Alaska considering or needing to move their communities inland. Let me just, I'll talk about one really important aspect of this project, and that is that we're practicing co-production of knowledge. So we're gonna develop the knowledge in this project with our community partners from the beginning of the project to the end of the project. And not only will we be co-producing our knowledge, we're actually going to be studying ourselves. So we're going to study how we work with the community participants in Utqiagvik, Alaska, how we develop knowledge together. So the project just started in January. We're really excited about it. It's a collaboration across 4 schools within the University of Virginia. Due to COVID, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to get to the field this summer, but we will get there as soon as we possibly can. Thank you.
Great, thanks to all. And in the interest of making this a conversation discussion, I'm going to invite you, go ahead and just unmute yourself, and that way you can just sort of jump in. I'm going to start with just some questions following up on this, and there have been some that many of you have already sent in, so we'll work from those, but please do continue to send Karen questions because we want to be sure to hear from you. So 2 things that strike me, maybe just to give the 3 of you a chance to respond to one another. Your questions are both commonality and some differences of scale, right? So commonality of interest in excluded, marginalized communities that have been given limited voice or have actually been excluded from voice, indigenous communities in the Arctic, communities around the nation and the world. So there are commonalities. One of the differences is thinking about sort of scale issues. Kimberly, you're thinking at the level of the state, right? And thinking about sort of policy making through state bodies, state entities, representative or non-representative. So there's this sort of the scale of the law and the scale of the state. Kimberly, Barbara, you're thinking about cities. right, and buildings and land use, right, and how things are really embedded at that level of the spaces that we move through, and how you're thinking at the level of the Arctic, right, a vast sort of geographical expanse. So kind of a first thing is, how do you think justice at those scales? How do you put them together? And then maybe a follow-up, if you wish, is to what extent do you think about justice, climate justice, as both a question of justice for the human communities in these different spaces, and a matter of justice to the non-human world, a matter of justice to non-human animal life, justice to the Arctic itself. You know, how do you balance this? So some questions about scale. Barbara, since you went first, I'm going to just ask you to kick us off, and then if you would just sort of bat this around a bit.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's, if you look at the to use a social movement example that I've already mentioned, the disability rights movement, the lived expertise of people at the local scale saying this, you know, navigation of the streetscape does not work for me, allowed for a change in local policy that was then scaled up to state level policy, the sorts of things that Dr. Fields is studying, that then allowed for the creation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and many iterations beyond it, right? So that local lived expertise always can feed up towards the redress of injustice if our systems function well enough, right? And so I do think there's an obvious thread there, which is one of the many reasons why Kim's work is so important, is to really think about, like, okay, well, how did that go? What did that look like? And are we then, you know, if the EPA is telling us we have a burden collectively as a nation to look at those disproportionate impacts and redress them, how well are we doing that, right? And that does require us looking at all scales in order to check our blind spots. So that would be one thing, which is why I think that the co-production of knowledge is so important, because of course we still always have blind spots, no matter what scale we're looking in, if we don't actually share power in the, you know, how the question is formed, how the research is collected, how is the data analyzed. And then in terms of non-human actors, you know, ideally we're going to think about, and one of the really exciting innovations that climate justice language and frameworks allow for is when you look at the Climate Justice Alliance that's working globally, but also intensely locally, they see non-human actors as essential parts of their organizing, right? So the co-benefit work and frame of climate justice really allows you to say, these are not one or the other. Like, we can make decisions that benefit both parties if we're creative and thoughtful. I'll pass the baton.
Yeah, so I can talk about it a little bit from a broader scale. If I think about a broader scale, the scale of the Arctic, or even broader than the Arctic, one thing I think one thing that stands out about this issue is climate doesn't really discriminate, and in a way that, so the main producers of greenhouse gases, so the emissions are coming from very disparate places in very disparate quantities around the globe, but those effects are then seen are seen around the globe. So the impacts of climate change are not felt in direct proportion to the emissions, to those doing the emissions. So it's, in a way, it's so climate change at the broader scale is kind of a tragedy of the commons problem, but then it manifests at finer scales. So even though carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, no matter where they're being emitted, get relatively spread out uniformly throughout the globe, then that manifests in our climate system to cause different types of climate change in different spaces. So in a way, you know, I may be thinking about this from a broader perspective, a regional or global perspective. But one of the things that we really have to understand is we have to understand how that manifests they can manifest at some very fine spatial scales, you know, landscape, cities, communities. One thing I will add about the human human question is that in many of these indigenous communities, there is not a distinction between human and non-human. They are effectively one and the same. And you think about particularly the community that I'm working in is a whaling community, and they do not think of themselves as they don't necessarily distinguish themselves from the whale. The humans and the whale are one and the same, and there's a human whale cycle, and that's the cycle of the whale offering themselves to the humans and providing sustenance for the humans, and then it's the goal or the obligation of the humans to then go out and continue hunting whales. So they're very intimately tied.
I was going to say something similar to Howie's last statement about how conceptions of the environment that informed environmental justice principles and activism came from Native American communities who were integral in kind of the pinnacle moment of environmental justice, of the environmental justice movement, where they constructed these 17 principles of environmental justice. And so that conception of the environment that is inclusive of and kind of recognizes the interdependence of species is reflected in those principles and guides the movement's work in important ways. In terms of scale, and I guess I kind of think of this in as the why states question. For me, states were kind of tasked with implementing lots of environmental policies, but in particular, environmental justice policies. And because of the federalist nature of American politics, that meant they had a lot of leeway, very little imposed rules around what they could develop. And so we get this hodgepodge of all different kinds of stuff. And so looking at states was interesting for me because it provided a lens through which to see how justice was conceived of differently, even in the same kind of nation state context. So what is meant by environmental justice and what is believed to be necessary to achieve it in the Deep Delta South looks different than what it does in New England states or in the Pacific Northwest. And that was kind of just an interesting intellectual question for me, why is justice defined so differently in different places? And if it's that it's being defined so differently, or is it that it's interacting with political and social and economic realities that shape and reshape how the issue gets defined and then implemented? And that's where my work led me, because if you have these open processes for defining the problem, it looks different than if you have a closed process for defining the problem. And some of what explains the variation in approaches at the state level to environmental justice is that they have these very different political processes that include, at very early stages, lots of diverse stakeholders, for lack of a better word, in the issue definition phase. And so what comes out of that phase shapes the subsequent trajectory of policies. And so it looks really different. So I would not have come to that had I not looked at it at the state level, because what comes out of the federal level is kind of, for lack of a better word, it's a little bland. It's kind of vague and ambiguous. It doesn't really get any meat on it until you start moving down. And I'm sure Barbara could probably speak a little more to this. about how it even gets more refined as you move further down the decision making, the governmental stages. And then to kind of piggyback a little more on a point Barbara made earlier, was that local kind of movements also put pressure on states to come up with definitions and programs and initiatives around environmental justice and climate justice. So it's not unidirectional. It doesn't just come down from the states. It comes down and it goes up, and then this kind of cycle where if it doesn't work, then you might get some grassroots pressure from below to change it. And so it's a very dynamic process, and kind of looking at the middle tier for me is an exciting kind of research decision, for lack of a better word.
Thanks, everybody. Barbara, do you want to pick up on that at all? And while you're doing that, could we bring up the second of the two? We prepared some poll questions. Could we bring up the second one? Because I'd like to get people's comments on it. We had some questions on this, but Barbara, anything you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the only thing to add to my colleagues' awesome contributions are just that language matters. And you know, we had an environmental movement that was largely white and affluent and focused on the non-human. And then we had a civil rights movement that was, you know, coalition based and about racial justice in many senses, but also included disability rights and other things. We see the environmental justice movement, as Kim mentioned, coming to a sort of place-based evolution that's trying to do both of these things. But I think if the evolution towards, you know, a sort of subset, or I don't know, Kim, I'd love your thoughts on like environmental justice versus climate justice and how these things, you know, how we think of them. But I think in terms of the way in which we think of climate justice as a global concern, but we still act in a place-based way, it feels like there's a real exciting potential between not only the pressure that Kim was mentioning from the local, but then also the ways in which our wonderful coalitions are building at the global scale that do both at the same time, will, I think, continue to make for more innovative policy.
So how you want to jump in on that, and then do please go ahead and submit the answer you want the poll. And I have an observation about how this conversation maybe makes the question of the poll like the wrong question to ask, but just in relation to what people are saying. How, anything you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, and I have some comments on the poll. I'm really curious. I'm very curious actually to see what our audience has to say. But I think I would just maybe clarify a point that I had before, and that is whereas you know, climate change is a global issue, and you know, it manifests globally. Emissions are occurring globally. The effects of climate change we see globally. But I think it's the inequities are found locally. So that the fact that this is global phenomenon will manifest in different ways in different places that produce these local scale inequities. And I think we see that in all over the place.
Thanks. So we'll get the poll results in just a minute. I think one of the reasons why I was saying that maybe the poll, which and interesting to see, let's all just kind of take a look at the outcome.
Oh, wow.
Right, local, national, yeah. Because I think part of what the panelists are suggesting is that even while we think about these different scales, the whole point is not to think them as discontinuous or non-related to one another, right? That there's a planetary system, right? There's a planetary phenomena that is emerging, but the planetary phenomena continuously enacts itself in uneven distributions of vulnerability to a common planetary condition. And it enacts itself, right, always in locales. And so to be able to think up and down and through the scales at once, I think is part of what the panelists are raising with us. Let me jump on another point here from this, and then please do keep putting questions in. I think Karen, who kicked us off, is kind of monitoring the Q&A and will be helping share some. So Karen, please do start passing things on. And in a number of your comments, you've talked about notions of the coalitional, right, and different kinds of coalition. So maybe coalition at local activist state, national, global coalition, coalition between communities, indigenous communities. Really appreciate that so much focus already on questions of indigeneity and indigenous communities, variety of minority communities, excluded communities. Part of the work of climate justice strikes me as such a crucial next movement in our thinking about intersectional thought, right? And the intersectional thought that has emerged from critical Black studies, feminist studies, queer studies, LGBTQ studies, how to think about intersections and coalitions. And to welcome any of your thoughts on that front. I want to ask one then very specifically. While this panel is taking place, the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd is taking place. And the urgency of thinking climate justice and the urgency of thinking justice against racism and against police violence are intersecting in real time. And just welcome any thoughts you have on that particular intersectionality, right? The particular intersectionality between climate justice, racial justice, justice movements against violence that is immediate and deadly on the street, and violence that sometimes unfolds over decades in life. So any thoughts any thoughts any of you have on thinking coalition and intersection and movements?
So I think one thing that I have learned when I wrote the book that Karen mentioned earlier, I used the language of vulnerability, and I stopped doing that because it doesn't point out that, and it's a thing that actually the resilience, practitioners and the climate practitioners use. It's a typical sort of science lens, but it acts as though it's a deficits-based language for something that actually, I think all of us on this panel understand that that these are burdens that are placed by a white supremacist structure that is very much made manifest in land use, but it's made manifest in our policing. Like racial violence is something that our history and even today we are subjected to, and and need to push back on in a much stronger way than we have been doing even until what's happening in Minneapolis this week. And we see that when there is a group that has a disproportionate burden in terms of like heat in the summer, we like that. These are all effects that have major consequences to the people having to suffer through that burden, and also should be acknowledged by those of us that are accruing more privilege. So I'll just say, as as a person who's really trying to check their privilege on a more regular basis, that isn't just about the disproportionate burdens and vulnerabilities, whatever language we want to use there, but it's also about the sort of hoarding of affluence and privilege that I think white people have consistently been doing in this country, and they're all related.
Yeah. Well, I have a few ways to go from there, but one direction I might go is to think about the ways that individuals can respond to climate change. And so there are several options, and so individuals can tolerate climate change, which is basically the deal with it method. Or they can acclimate, so they can change their behavior in some way, shape, or form to be able to deal with climate change. They can avoid climate change, so they can move to an area that may not be as impacted by climate change, or mitigation. Okay, so they can develop mitigation strategies like seawalls or levees or irrigating during dry times, or cooling strategies when it's really hot. But the it becomes an environmental justice issue because those options are not available to everyone. Okay, if it's a marginalized population, then the latter two, the avoidance and the mitigation, may not be available at all, and it's only the former two, the tolerance or acclimation, that is available to those communities.
Yeah, it's a tough one for me. Like, I'm kind of, deeply affected by just the reality of living in a moment like this. And unfortunately have kind of personal experiences with with police violence. So it's an extraordinarily difficult topic just to even talk about. But the one of the things that came to my mind when I was thinking about your question is that they both, climate injustice and the racial dimensions of police brutality and the violence that particularly Black people in the US, but also throughout the world experience, is that they both kind of undermine and threaten human flourishing and dignity. And they kind of are both derived from similar processes and arrangements that were developed at particular moments in time for very specific reasons. And as Barbara mentioned, kind of contribute to the accumulation of protection and benefits away from within some population segment of the world's population and away from other segments of the world population. So they are built upon and maintained and reproduced by these arrangements. And they continue to serve that end. Additionally, they are very, very difficult to create interventions for that eliminate the outcomes associated with them. It's deeply, deeply embedded in the way things are structured, operate, and incredibly resistant to all kinds of opposition, right? But despite the size of the coalition that we might be able to bring together, right? It is not the case that millions, if not billions, of people across the globe are united against it, against both things, the arrangements and processes that lead to climate injustice as well as racial injustice. There's, we can document the size in a lot of ways of these coalitions in terms of organizations that have explicit missions. We know in lots of ways their membership numbers, we have huge coalitions across space and time, have not been extraordinarily successful in undoing or dismantling the arrangements that undergird both, the logics and arrangement that undergird both environmental, the racial dimensions of environmental inequality and climate inequality, as well as racial inequality. Yeah, I'll stop there. It's a it's a thing for me, but I appreciate the question.
Thank you. Thank all of you. If I can, Kimberly, pick up a little bit on one of the last things you were saying in relationship to a question that has come in. Coalitions and interventions, and where can coalitions help generate interventions, and how do we think about the paucity of interventions, right, that have had an impact. So the question that's come in is then about policies. And so let me just read it. It's one posed first directly to you and then generally. How can climate change policies address the systemic burdens borne by marginalized populations that have resulted in environmental inequality and then particularly, I think for all of us, but particularly, Kimberly, for you, what are current policies in Virginia that you would point to, would think about, current policies in Virginia that will promote environmental justice where it's most needed? So turn to you and then pick up Barbara Howie.
Yeah, I guess I could start with Virginia. Virginia is in a pretty unique moment in terms of its development of environmental justice and climate change policies. So in 2017, I believe the current administration kind of put at the center of its environmental agenda a focus on environmental justice, and somewhat a latecomer in terms of like what other states have done, but nonetheless, has made it a priority to include considerations of environmental justice in its environmental agenda. And so they've created an advisory group, have commissioned some studies to identify particularly vulnerable areas, and stressed populations. And in kind of the reports that they've generated have gestured towards targeting protection and resources to those areas and those populations, which would be one of the recommendations, I guess, to the degree that I would feel comfortable giving recommendations that I have observed from other states' environmental justice and climate change efforts. One of the things that has seemed to work well and that reflects what impacted populations have requested from their governments was that they would be protected, there would be enhanced protections for those populations, that resources would be targeted to those areas and populations, and designed to not just reduce but eliminate the consumption and production and extraction practices that were degrading their environments. So there's this push for a transition away from status quo as it pertains to consumption and production and extraction practices towards other types of arrangements and processes and practices. So those are kind of, I guess, some of the things I've observed.
Great. Thank you. Barbara, anything you want to weigh in on?
Yeah, I'll just only add a little bit to Kim's great answer, which is there's towards that coalition question as well. There's a Virginia multifamily energy efficiency coalition, which is actually, there's a sort of national energy efficiency for all. And there's a few other groups like that where Virginia is learning deeply about where to put its investments, right? So so this is a huge opportunity for us to be thinking. Charlottesville just became a place with free transit, which is absolutely a climate justice issue. If transit is legible, easy to use, which making it free is definitely a huge, removal of one of those barriers. That's a great win. So all of the investments in public transit that we can be making across the state are investments in climate justice if done properly. Thinking through energy burden. So the multifamily coalition is one way to think through that, but also making sure that all of those burdens are then countered, right, with ways that at the larger affordable housing metric, it's easier to disperse those funds, but also thinking through the ways that we can make sure that people can retrofit their houses and reduce that disproportionate burden that's often placed on households would be my only addition. I think those are things that energy cooperatives, other ways to distribute our energy production so that it is generative for lots of people. Those are all opportunities that I think Virginia is trying to make more robust.
Okay, thanks. Howie, anything either
Great.
at any level or others? Policy?
Yeah, sure. Just maybe adding briefly briefly at the global scale. So global policies regarding greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, they benefit everyone. So it's sort of the opposite of the tragedy of the commons. It's the comedy of the commons, or whatever the opposite of tragedy might be. If it's a benefit, it's a benefit of the commons. I think that Biden's initial plan was a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And in his executive order of January 27th, 40% of investments in clean energy and clean energy infrastructure would go towards marginalized communities. So these, and plus our rejoining the Paris Accord, which puts us in line with all of the other nations around the globe, as a player is committed to greenhouse gas reductions. All of those things are really, really important at the global scale. But it's really resources, and those resources come at all scales. So federal, state, and local resources that go into that go into clean energy and also mitigation, climate change mitigation strategies for underserved populations.
Great, thanks. Yeah,
I should add food to this mix. There's a lot of really great things happening locally in Charlottesville through Cultivate Charlottesville, but there's also state and multi-state region cooperatives that are really, or coalitions that are really centering Black and brown farmers and trying to make sure that our investment is also in the production of local food, that those resources are distributed, in a way that kind of redresses the past injustices about agricultural practices as well.
Great, thank you. Either of you, Kimberly, how we want to ask about food, and then I'm going to follow up on one of the global policy things. What do you think about that? So this picks up on something all of you said, but Howie, maybe vis-a-vis Paris Accord, but other sort of global level policy proposals and solutions. So a question has come in. I'd be curious if any of you have thoughts on global climate solutions manifesting as what some climate scholars of the global south are calling carbon colonialism, and how to navigate these solutions, particularly given the local impacts of climate change, as Professor Epstein mentioned. So I'm not 100% certain, but I think it's possible that what this is referring to, and some of you might know the particular reference, but is that even carbon reduction solutions, when there are legacy nations that have been high carbon polluters for centuries and have benefited in their infrastructure, in their electrical systems, therefore in their health systems, in their roads, right, are now calling on equal carbon reductions in societies, nations that haven't, in effect, accrued the sort of the poison effect of that development, and so how do you think about that unevenness, right? I think that might be, and others might know, but anyone want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, just as you can think about it at the local scale, the uneven distribution and the sort of those in power place the toxic things and extracted resources from those that did not have power at the time. We've done that as nation states, and thinking about redress and thinking about who has accrued wealth and at the burdens of who. We see that already in who has to have forced migration, who's suffering the greatest burdens right now of climate injustice. It's not happening. It is happening in the United States, but it's happening at a much greater level to the other nations that we have extracted from, and who are downwind and sort of down in the power infrastructure so that they're suffering from the decisions that we make and the sort of affluence that we have accrued as a nation. So.
Thanks, Kimberly.
I've also thought about this from the perspective of who makes the decisions about what is going to be done at global scale, like where those decisions are made, who participates in those decision-making processes. about what's going to happen, what's going to be done to address climate change. So if those procedures or processes for decision making at the global scale, if they are unbalanced, or the power imbalance between the people, the nation states that are part of that institution, where decisions are getting made, if that's not leveled, there is again this dimension of injustice, and it there are all kinds of indirect ways that a disadvantaged actor vis-a-vis the power arrangements could agree to something that is not necessarily reflective of their interest or need, because they're enmeshed in this global kind of arrangement that they have to take other things into consideration. So I've been interested in kind of the procedure for making decisions about what needs to happen at a global scale. And then the other thought I had was related to ensuring that the responsibility and the costs of whatever decision is made about how to address climate change doesn't fall disproportionately on the least capable of absorbing that cost, whatever it might be. And this is something that comes up in like the G77 discussions around efforts to address climate change.
Thanks. Howie, anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the carbon colonialization it's a really interesting, it's a very important topic, but we've really struggled to get where we are right now, and that pushes it even further. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it really would take a great effort, globally to move along those lines. The biggest emitters around the globe are some very different nations with very different stages of development. You're talking the United States, well, and China and India and Russia and the European Union, and they're, those are the, 5 top emitters, and they're very, they're also very disparate nations or groups of nations. So it will be a challenge.
Thanks. So we've got just a few minutes left. So I'm going to take one last question that's come in, and then also kind of wrap by offering all of you an opportunity to think a little bit about the title of this whole series of gatherings, which is Climate Ambition, which I think has written into it some idea of kind of hope or aspiration in addition to analysis and recognition, right, of damage. And so the question is, it kind of goes from the global to grounds. What is UVA doing to promote a just transition in grounds? And then specific questions about the impact of running the physical plant, the university's investment strategy. So anything you're thinking about to sort of at the level of the university specifically, welcome. And then maybe brief on that, and then I'll loop back to you again, sense of ambition or hope, or within the work that kind of keeps you going. We've got about 5 minutes, so if anyone wants to touch briefly on the grounds question, then we'll loop back through the ambition.
Yeah, maybe I'll try quickly. From my perspective, we need to continue working on understanding the science of climate change, how it's going to affect different places around the globe, and therefore different communities. So what are these communities already encountering with respect to climate change? And what can they expect in the future? And that's one of our big unknowns. What can they expect in the future? And so the more science we can put into that, the better off we're going to be. We need to ramp up our engagement with communities. We don't only need to work in communities, we need to work with communities and for communities on environmental justice issues. And just a couple of things specific, Department of Environmental Sciences is going to be hiring, hopefully next year, an environmental sciences professor who studies environmental justice in Black dominated communities. And that's going to be somebody very new for our department. So that's really exciting. And then the new democracy lab that Kimberly is a part of on environmental justice. Kimberly co-directs that. And one of our faculty members in environmental sciences, Sally Pusedi, is on that. And she looks at air pollution in marginalized community. So there's a lot to be encouraged with UVA, and a lot more that we can do.
Great, thanks. Kimberly, you want to pick up on that, and anything else you want to say on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I would amplify Howie's points, continue to support and incentivize research and scholarship that tries to better understand and prevent further inequality, and then evaluate the interventions that do exist. I think that's useful information for impacted populations to have, and then to share that information freely with the public that subsidizes the university. So those would be my recommendations in terms of UVA, and the Repair Lab has as part of it a practitioner in residence that is designed to bring into conversation with people working on and around environmental justice issues at UVA to support the projects that that person would already have going. So
great, thanks. And for those of you who don't know, this is a new lab that Kimberly and other colleagues are launching, the Repair Lab, right, on environmental justice and race. Barbara.
Yeah, so we've been at the Equity Center partnering not only with the UVA Office of Sustainability. Andrea Trimble's been a great partner for us in thinking about the role of UVA as an anchor institution, as a major employer, as a major healthcare provider in these very issues locally, and as a major landowner. And so we've been working, Princeton has an environmental justice plan in their Office of Sustainability that many universities are now using as a model. And we've been working with them to not only think about our own policies, practices, other programs internal to the university at large, but also the facilities and our planning and what we value and how we measure success, with both the surrounding municipalities, but also Cultivate Charlottesville, C3, a bunch of, the Public Housing Association of Residents and other key grassroots leadership organizations on how we measure our own thriving in terms of a climate justice lens, and how we might plan collectively as a region, because any one group can't do it, but if we do it all together and we think about district level energy, district level transportation, the valuing of certain businesses that maybe didn't get centered in the past. That's the work we're doing right now, is really building coalitions that are inclusive of UVA as a player, but they're not the center. And so that's been really fun to be a part of. And we're creating the tools through our democratization of data platform that center the lived expertise of those who have had to overcome this level of oppression, but also feed into decision-making standards at both the university, the city, and the county from a planning perspective.
Great, thank you. Deep thanks to all of you, the three of you on the panel, Howie, Kimberly, Barbara, and to all of you for joining us. And I'm going to turn things back over now to Karen.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Barbara, Kim, and Howie for this conversation. I was in looking at the questions. I want to just mention one comment that Sheila made, who it was a quote. She can't remember where it's from. I'm not sure where it's from either, but it says, "We are all in the same ocean, but not in the same boat." And I think it captures a lot of what we're saying. This is a planetary crisis that we're in right now with climate change, yet our dealing with it is going to be at the local level. And so we need to have community engagement. We need to have place-based local work, regional work that's going to feed back on the climate, and the climate's going to feed back on it. And so I think that is a really critical challenge to sort of cross those scales. And the last thing I wanted to mention that you all brought up was the idea that we have to have both in the climate justice world, we have to think about both adaptation, because there's a certain amount of climate change that's baked into the system that we're just going to have to deal with, that we also have to figure out how to slow it all down. And so that's where the climate ambition came from for this summit, and that's how we are viewing this. And I invite everyone who is here listening to us to join us for the last event of this Climate Ambition Summit, which was with President Jim Ryan and Professor Arun Majumdar from Stanford, to have just that conversation. How are we going to make just, equitable, economically viable, human flourishing population, flourishing population, as Kim said, in a climate future? And so I think that'll be a super exciting end to this series. And I really thank you all on the panel, and thank you all the participants. We had over 400 people who registered for this program. So it's clearly a really important issue that we're dealing with here at UVA. So thank you all very much, and hope to see you on Thursday.